For the Son of Man himself came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Like a lot of you, I've been thinking about my privilege in the last few months. This morning I left my house at about 10 after 7 to get here in time to help with setup before the 8 o'clock daybreak service. I was driving down Gough Street and I ran into a marathon. And if you don't live in San Francisco, it's hard. Because they don't always tell you when the marathons are going to be, and they never tell you what the route is going to be, so they never tell you what the street closures are going to be necessarily. And I'm driving the way that I know to get here through a marathon, and the whole time I'm complaining about the privilege of these marathoners. Because, you know, some of us work on Sundays. Thank you very much. And I had to stop and try to figure out where I was going. I looked at my phone. It's the Nike Women's Marathon. I was like, Nike privilege, women's privilege, marathon privilege. And of course, the thing was, I was driving my brand new, all-electric Fiat 500, which I bought because it gives me the privilege of driving in the diamond lane whenever I want to. So when I was in the East Bay last week, driving on the diamond lane and then getting on the carpool lane to looking down and bypassing all the people backed up at the metering thing to get on the Bay Bridge, yeah, I loved that privilege. I was driving with Lauren Lucasen back from CDSP, she's our former intern, and I was exulting in my privilege. And she's like, you know, I bet pretty soon they'll have diamond lanes all over San Francisco. And I thought to myself, really? And I think what I'm recognizing in this ridiculous example of privilege is that privilege is expansive. There was an article last week in the New York Times about electric vehicles in California and how people that drive electric vehicles feel a special kind of privilege, like unplugging the other car and plugging their car in privilege. Privilege is expansive. It grows inside of you. A little privilege builds a little bit more privilege, builds a little bit more privilege. And privilege wants to grow in our lives. It has to be stated obvious. Privilege has to grow in our lives at the expense of other people. Even people that we may love, even people we may esteem. Because privilege wants more privilege. And above all, privilege is not interested in serving other people. According to the culture of privilege, service is something relegated to somebody else. The people who do service, at least in the culture of privilege, are considered inferior in some way. And maybe this is where James and John have stumbled in today's gospel reading. Maybe they have a sense of privilege that looks at Jesus' other followers as somehow inferior to them. Because maybe they believe they are the ones who deserve the best seats in God's glory, not the other disciples. But what Jesus says to James and John really does make me check my sense of privilege. Because Jesus says to James and John that he is simply unable to give them what they want. They say, well, we have a favor to ask. We would like for you to give us your right-hand seat and your left-hand seat when you come into your glory. And Jesus doesn't say, no, you can't have that. That's not, bad disciple. Jesus says, that is not mine to give. Because his program is different from the one that is directing James and John. Jesus says that there's only one way to be privileged in God's glory, and that's by serving other people. So if you're looking for signs of God in your life, you've got to look in the direction of service. That's where God is present when you're serving somebody else. Service is the perfect indicator of God. Service is the perfect place to look to see where God is right now. And that's particularly the case in the context of communities of people, which complicates things. Because sometimes in a community, you're the one being served by somebody who's doing the service, and sometimes you're the one doing the service to someone who needs to be served. And don't make the mistake that just because you want to serve a person means you're serving a person. Because privilege is tricky that way. Privilege can also look like, I will serve you the way I want, and you'll get to be just like me. Woo-hoo. So even the concept of service is complicated. Jesus is revealing something in this gospel reading which I find to be extraordinary, something new about God, which is that God is perfectly revealed as a servant. That God doesn't exist to be worshiped and adored, God exists to serve. This is the revelation of God that Jesus delivers to his followers, and it's in a particular context. We didn't read the first part of this longer gospel section. It's the final of 3 predictions that Jesus makes in Mark's gospel about his suffering and his death, his going to the cross. And that sort of is the context within which this language of service, I think, is meant to be heard. And we'll get to that in a second. But I want to go back to James and John. James and John ask about the best seats in heaven. And I think that they're asking the wrong question. And it's not because they shouldn't care about, where they're located in heaven, but because every seat in heaven is the best seat. Or to put it another way, the challenge is not that we have to strive continually to gain God's favor or to get the best seats at the heavenly banquet. The challenge is that every good thing has already been given to us. There are no bad seats because, whatever heaven means, it's defined by abundance versus scarcity. The challenge, for me at least, is that we're called to seek after heaven, whatever that means, in the most mundane places in life. And those are the places where we're being called to live into God's identity, which is to be a servant. Just like God, we get to serve one another in mundane, ordinary, everyday places in life. And that, again, that's a piece of the Jesus teaching which catches me up short, the ordinariness of it. My challenge is not to take on some kind of supercharged, martyr-esque spiritual life of service. I doubt I am going to have to throw myself on a grenade today to save your life. But I may have to do something that's even more challenging to me. I may have to become vulnerable to your pain in relationship. Or, I may have to carry a baby around, or I may have to teach a child to tie his shoes, or I may have to sit at your deathbed, or I may just have to go to the grocery store for you. My challenge is getting out of bed each day and just living with a care for other people. And again, the promise is that in the midst of these everyday acts of service, we get to see God at work. Because it's in service that we get to see what God really looks like as a servant. And this really matters to me because the world is in a crisis about privilege. And we can talk about electric car privilege or marathon privilege, but we need to talk about white privilege and the privilege of wealth over poverty and the privilege of class and the privilege of gender. Because all of these are destroying the world. They just are. And the world is our home, the only home that we can see. And I got to admit that human beings are fabulous, but human beings are a mixture of good and bad. And we've got this one pernicious habit, which is that we're willing and able to sacrifice somebody else to push back the fear of scarcity, to construct a world of safety on the basis of whatever kind of privilege we think we can claim. And if this was the only way that life flowed, I'd be willing to just give up. But I believe that we're actually called to unmake this world. And I believe that there's already been an intervention that makes clear to us and to all other people that we are loved irrespective of what we do or do not do. And it's on the basis of that love that we can unmake the world of privilege. On the basis of that unmerited love, we don't have to fear that we will disappear into a void of scarcity. We don't have to play the privilege game. And the intervention is the part of the gospel that we did not read this morning, the part about the cross. This is the act of service that Jesus takes on most perfectly. So that in John's gospel, it's what they call his glory. Today's gospel begins with another of these Jesus predictions about passion and death, and it ends with his talking about giving his life as a ransom. And let's just be honest about it and say that that has been a fraught idea in Christian history. Because some people want to say that it's about paying off God's anger by Jesus giving himself to the cross, which sounds completely and categorically wrong to me. Because the metaphor of ransom is all about an exchange between God and humankind. God buys us back with the ransom of his own life, which he doesn't lose. Jesus goes into the captivity of death for us, and he goes into captivity to death at the hands of those that he loves, who are also us. But he returns in the resurrection as the one who cannot be held captive by death, because death has no more dominion over him, therefore death has no more dominion over us. We will all die, but we will not die and disappear forever. We will die and be alive in God. And in the life of God, manifested in God's Spirit in us, we remain connected to those who have died, which at least means that there's nothing to fear in God's gift, because in God's gift there is only life. Friday, very early in the morning, I flew to Memphis, Tennessee to go to Phyllis Tickle's funeral, which was a privilege to be a part of. And that evening I flew to Houston, where I used to work, for another funeral. Yesterday morning at 10 o'clock, I was privileged to serve as a part of the funeral for my friend Jennifer Cobb. Jennifer is a young woman who died very suddenly about a month ago, and I first knew her when she was a 6th grader in my youth group. I was privileged. I was privileged to be there, to be in her service. And what I said, because I was asked to speak, what I said was that Jennifer, who was only 38 years old when she died, was everywhere. And what I also said was the last time that I saw Jennifer was at the Wild Goose Festival last summer, we had a Sunday morning healing service, and I've talked about that before here. But we had a Sunday morning healing service, and Jennifer was one of the people that came up to me for prayer because she was at the Wild Goose Festival, because Jennifer's always everywhere. And she walked up to me, and behind her the sun was rising over the hills, above the river, by the camp where we're meeting. And I laid my hands on her, and I don't remember what I said, but what I remember was seeing the sun rising. And I remember the sun rising in her. And in that moment, the sun rising in the east and my prayer rising to God for Jennifer, I had that sense that she was going to be perfectly well and that her life ended too soon, but that her life continues to rise in my memory and in the memory of everyone else who knew her and loved her. So after my friend Patrick, who was preaching the homily, finished, we were exchanging the peace, and I walked over to him and I gave him a big hug, and he said, "Promise me that you won't die. Too many people have died." And I said, "Patrick, I promise you I will die." But don't be afraid, because the life that we share, because of God's gift to us, will keep us together forever. See, privilege to me is like that. It's the privilege of being present with another person and speaking truth that hurts a little but also makes more life. The privilege of serving Jennifer by praying for her that morning, the privilege of honoring her mother's request that I come to her funeral, I mean, that's really the only kind of privilege that I desire. And all I really want is to be present in this life and hope for the next. And know that the life that continues to flow between me and Jennifer and everyone else that I love who's died is the life of God. And that life never stops flowing between us all. So that death doesn't hold us. Death cannot even contain that suffering servant of God. Not even death can stop the revolution that was begun by God in Jesus Christ. And if we live in that spirit of service, we can claim before the world that there's nothing better than being a servant of others. And in that pathway there is life, and there is abundance, and there is true greatness. And in that pathway, I think we do discover a piece of truth, that is, our freedom is found in perfect service.